That is an unapproved water feature, and it needs to be filled in immediately. Her voice, a high-pitched whine that could curdle milk, sliced through the tranquil morning air. Brenda, the self-appointed queen of the estates at Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my property, her hands planted firmly on her hips. Her floral print blouse was stretched taut across a frame that suggested a deep and abiding love for boxed wine and neighborhood gossip. I lowered the binoculars I'd been using to watch a family of deer at the far end of my meadow and turned to face her. I took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the cool, clean air, a stark contrast to the acrid entitlement radiating from my uninvited guest. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, my voice calm and even. "First, you're trespassing. My property line is another 20 yards back, at the old stone wall. Second, that is not a water feature. That is a Class II artesian spring, and it's the primary reason I bought this land." She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that probably worked wonders on the spineless sycophants who comprised her HOA board. "I don't care what you call it. It's a body of water not sanctioned by the Architectural Review Committee. It's a liability. It attracts mosquitoes. It needs to go." I almost laughed. It was like telling a mountain it was an unapproved geological formation. I had spent 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, designing and overseeing projects that moved rivers and fortified coastlines. I knew water. I knew the intricate dance of hydrology and geology that made a spring like this a minor miracle. To hear it described as a nuisance by this woman, whose chief engineering feat was likely coordinating a neighborhood potluck, was an insult to the laws of physics themselves. "Brenda," I said, keeping my tone educational, as if explaining something to a particularly slow child. "This spring has been here for probably 1,000 years. It's part of the local watershed. It is protected by state and federal environmental regulations. Filling it in would not only be geologically stupid, it would be a felony." Her face, already pinched with indignation, tightened further, the skin around her mouth turning a pale, bloodless white. "Don't you quote your regulations at me. I am the president of this HOA, and what I say goes. The bylaws are very clear about unapproved landscaping." This was the point where a normal person might realize they were standing on shaky ground, legally and literally. Brenda was not a normal person. She was a petty tyrant, ruler of a small, beige kingdom of identical houses, and my property, my wild, untamed, and most importantly, separate property, was an intolerable affront to her authority. "I will be issuing you a formal violation notice," she screeched, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You will have 14 days to comply. After that, we will begin fining you $500 a day. If you refuse to pay, we will place a lien on your property and foreclose. We'll see how you like your precious spring then." She spun on her heel and stomped back towards the manicured lawns of her domain, leaving a wake of righteous fury. I watched her go, the anger I should have felt replaced by something else entirely. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced since my last command, a cold, quiet clarity that settled over me like a familiar cloak. The peaceful retiree I had tried so hard to become receded, and the colonel returned. This woman hadn't just made an irrational demand. She had declared war. And in my professional opinion, her tactical assessment of the situation was catastrophically flawed. She had chosen the terrain, but I would choose the terms of engagement. A slow smile spread across my face. My retirement was about to get a lot more interesting. Hey everyone, if you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board or a neighborhood tyrant who thinks their opinion is law, then you're going to want to hear this. It's a story about the right to be left alone and the beautiful, systematic dismantling of an abuser's authority. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't want to miss how this plays out. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. It's always good to know you're not alone in the trenches. Now, let me tell you how this all started. After 3 decades of moving wherever the Army sent me, from the deserts of Iraq to the floodplains of the Mississippi, all I wanted was a piece of land to call my own. A place where the only orders I had to follow came from the changing of the seasons. My career with the Corps of Engineers had been rewarding, but it was a life lived on the grid, dictated by project timelines, budget reviews, and the endless bureaucracy of government work. I was tired. I yearned for silence, for the rustle of leaves instead of the hum of fluorescent lights, for the smell of damp earth instead of stale coffee. My search for this sanctuary took almost a year. I looked at properties all over the country, but nothing felt right. Then a realtor, a sharp old woman who seemed to understand what I was looking for without me having to say it, called me about a unique parcel. "It's a bit of an odd duck," she'd said over the phone. "It's an old farmstead, about 20 acres, completely surrounded by a new, high-end subdivision. The original farmer refused to sell this last piece to the developers. When he passed, his kids just wanted to get rid of it. The key thing is, it was never incorporated into the subdivision's plat. It's an island." An island. The word resonated with me. When I saw it, I knew I was home. The property was a perfect rectangle of rolling meadow and old-growth hardwood forest. A sturdy, 100-year-old farmhouse stood on a small rise, needing work but solid as a fortress. And at the bottom of the meadow, nestled in a grove of ancient willows, was the spring. It bubbled up from the earth, cool and clear, feeding a small, meandering creek that cut across the property before disappearing into the woods. It was the heart of the place. During the purchase process, I was meticulous. My entire career was built on due diligence and triple-checking every detail. I hired the best title attorney in the county. We spent hours poring over deeds, surveys, and county records going back to the original land grant in the 1880s. The conclusion was unequivocal. My 20 acres were legally distinct, a standalone parcel with its own deed, its own tax ID, and no covenants, conditions, or restrictions attached, save for standard county zoning. It was not and had never been part of the estates at Whispering Pines. I closed on the property and spent the first 6 months of my retirement in blissful labor. I repaired the farmhouse, cleared brush, and spent hours just walking the land, learning its contours and rhythms. The neighbors in the subdivision mostly kept to themselves. I'd get a polite wave from a passing car, but that was it. They lived in their world of pristine lawns and identical mailboxes, and I lived in mine. The peace lasted exactly 1 year. That's when Brenda was elected HOA president. From what I gathered later, she had won on a platform of restoring property values and enforcing the standards that make this community elite. Her reign of terror began with memos about the approved shade of beige for deck stain and the maximum permissible height of garden gnomes. I watched from my island of tranquility, vaguely amused. It wasn't my circus, not my monkeys. Until the morning Brenda decided to invade my island and declare war on a geological feature. The first official salvo arrived 3 days after our confrontation. It wasn't just a letter, it was a statement. It was delivered not by the postman, but by a courier, and printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock that felt more like a wedding invitation than a violation notice. An ostentatious gold-embossed logo at the top depicted a pine cone and a gavel, which I found unintentionally hilarious. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate speak. It cited 3 separate bylaws, none of which were relevant, regarding unapproved landscaping, unfenced water hazards, and failure to maintain aesthetic harmony with the community. It formally demanded I remediate the non-compliant water feature within 14 days. A fine of $500 was already attached for the initial violation. My first reaction was not anger. It was a cold, professional assessment of an opponent's opening move. It was poorly researched, legally baseless, and predicated entirely on an assumption of authority that did not exist. It was, in short, an amateur's gambit. I drove to the local office supply store. I walked past the flimsy school folders and went straight to the professional section. I selected a heavy-duty, 3-inch D-ring binder in a stark, intimidating black. I bought a pack of reinforced, archival quality page protectors, a set of numbered divider tabs, and a high-quality 3-hole punch. Back home, I set my new acquisitions on my large oak desk. I took Brenda's pretentious letter, punched 3 perfect holes in the left margin, and slid it into the first page protector. It clicked into the binder with a satisfying snap. On a clean sheet of paper, I wrote a title page in neat block letters. Operation Spring Freedom. This was no longer a simple disagreement. It was a mission. And every mission requires meticulous documentation. The binder was my command center, my opposition research file, my entire campaign consolidated into one physical object. It was where Brenda's empire would come to be cataloged, cross-referenced, and ultimately dismantled. My response had to be calibrated perfectly. It couldn't be emotional. It had to be firm, factual, and utterly devoid of any language that could be misinterpreted as aggression. It needed to be the kind of letter that would look very, very good as Exhibit A in a courtroom. I spent the next hour drafting it. I began by acknowledging receipt of her correspondence, referencing its date. I then stated, clearly and concisely, that my property, identified by its specific county parcel number, was not and had never been subject to the covenants and restrictions of the estates at Whispering Pines HOA. As evidence, I attached a certified copy of my deed and a copy of the official county plat map, on which I had highlighted my property's boundaries in yellow and the HOA's boundaries in pink. The two did not overlap. Next, I addressed the spring itself. I stated that it was a natural artesian spring, a feature of the land's topography. I then cited the specific state environmental protection statute that governed natural watersheds, quoting the relevant section verbatim. I explained that any attempt to alter or destroy it would constitute a violation of this statute, punishable by severe fines and potential jail time. I concluded the letter by politely but firmly requesting that the HOA immediately rescind the violation notice and the associated fine. I also formally notified them that any further entry onto my property by any member of the HOA board or its agents would be considered criminal trespass. I printed 2 copies. One went into the binder, right behind Brenda's letter. The other was folded neatly, placed in a business envelope, and taken to the post office. I sent it via certified mail, with return receipt requested. The green slip, once signed by Brenda and returned to me, would be irrefutable proof that she had received and read my rebuttal. It would be her signature on the document that proved she had been warned. The little green card came back to me 5 days later, bearing Brenda's spiky, self-important signature. I slid it into a page protector and clicked it into the binder. The ball was in her court. I had presented her with facts, evidence, and the law. A rational person would have recognized their error, consulted an attorney, and backed down. Brenda's response arrived a week later. It was another cream-colored envelope, but this one felt different. It was thicker. Inside was a single-page letter and a sheaf of invoices. The letter was breathtaking in its arrogance. It stated that my appeal had been reviewed by the board and denied. It claimed my documents were irrelevant and that the aesthetic and safety standards of the community superseded my so-called property rights. The fines had not been rescinded. In fact, they had been escalated. The initial $500 fine was now augmented by 7 days of non-compliance fines at $500 per day. The total now stood at $4,000. She had also helpfully included an invoice for legal review fees in the amount of $750, which she claimed was the cost for the HOA's lawyer to review my letter. I found that highly doubtful. No competent lawyer would have looked at my evidence and advised her to double down. More likely, she had pocketed the money or paid it to a crony. This was no longer just a legal disagreement. This was harassment. This was an attempt at extortion. I carefully three-hole punched the new letter and the invoices, filing them in the binder behind the certified mail receipt. The binder was getting heavier. It felt good. It felt like progress. My initial strategy of a single, decisive rebuttal had failed to neutralize the threat. The enemy was more irrational than anticipated. It was time to escalate to Phase 2 of Operation Spring Freedom, reconnaissance and fortification. I dedicated the next Saturday to deep research. My 30 years in the Corps weren't just about building things. They were about understanding the complex web of regulations that govern land and water. I knew that for every petty bylaw an HOA could invent, there were a dozen state and federal laws that could crush it like a sledgehammer on a snail. I brewed a large pot of coffee, sat down at my desk, and began to dig. I went past the general environmental statutes I had cited in my first letter and dove into the specifics. I pulled up state water rights laws, riparian regulations, and EPA guidelines on protected wetlands. After about 3 hours, I found it, the smoking gun. It was a small, almost forgotten piece of state legislation from the late 1970s, enacted after a series of droughts, the Natural Springs and Headwaters Protection Act. It was designed to protect the ultimate sources of the state's drinking water. The language was ironclad. It explicitly stated that any naturally occurring artesian spring that was documented on geological surveys prior to 1980 was designated a critical state water resource. Any action by any person, corporation, or association that impedes, diverts, pollutes, or otherwise diminishes such a resource was not just a civil infraction, but a criminal offense. A Class C felony, to be exact. My heart started to beat a little faster. I cross-referenced the coordinates of my spring with the United States Geological Survey archives. And there it was, on a dusty topographical map from 1962. A tiny blue dot and the symbol for a perennial spring, right in the middle of what was now my property. Brenda wasn't just demanding I do something illegal. She was demanding I commit a felony, and she was putting that demand in writing. This changed everything. This was no longer a squabble over property lines. I was now the custodian of a protected state resource, and she was threatening it. The next step was to engage higher authorities. On Monday morning, I called the State Department of Environmental Protection. I navigated their phone tree until I got a human, a helpful-sounding woman in the Water Resources Division. I explained the situation calmly and factually, omitting any personal animosity towards Brenda. I just laid out the facts. I owned the land, the spring was there, and a neighboring HOA was demanding, in writing, that I fill it in. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "They want you to do what?" the woman finally asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "Fill it in," I repeated. "They've fined me $4,000 so far for not complying." I could hear her typing furiously. "Sir, can you give me the parcel number of your property and the name of this Homeowners Association?" I gave her the information. More typing. "Okay, Colonel," she said, her tones shifting from helpful bureaucrat to determined ally. "I see your spring on the historical survey maps. It is absolutely a protected resource. What this HOA is doing is grossly illegal. I am opening a formal case file right now. Would you be willing to forward copies of the correspondence you've received from them?" "I can have them scanned and emailed to you within the hour," I said. "Excellent. We will be sending a formal cease and desist order to the HOA, care of its president, Miss Brenda." She paused. "Oh dear, I know that name. She calls us every few months to complain about algae in the subdivision's retention pond. This is going to be fun." I hung up the phone with a profound sense of satisfaction. I had now officially brought in air support. The state government was on my side, but I wasn't done. A good commander knows that victory is never assured by a single line of attack. Brenda's power came from the perceived consent of the other homeowners. She ruled by fear, intimidation, and the apathy of her subjects. It was time to see if I could build a resistance movement. That afternoon, I took a walk, not on my property, but through the pristine, curving streets of the estates at Whispering Pines. I was careful to stay on the public sidewalk. I wasn't looking for a fight, I was looking for allies. I saw an elderly man meticulously tending his rose bushes. His name was Arthur. I introduced myself, and we chatted for a few minutes about gardening. Then I casually mentioned the HOA. Arthur's face clouded over. "That woman," he muttered, snipping a dead bloom with unnecessary force. "Last month I got a violation because my garden hose wasn't coiled in a perfectly circular fashion. $200 fine." I sympathized with him and moved on. A few houses down, a young mother was pushing a toddler on a swing set in her backyard. I waved, and she came over to the fence. I asked her how she liked the neighborhood. "It's nice," she said hesitantly, "but the HOA is a nightmare. We got a letter because my son's tricycle was visible from the street for more than 4 hours. Brenda told my husband we were lowering the tone of the community. It was the same story everywhere I went. Petty tyranny, arbitrary enforcement, and fines levied for the most ridiculous infractions. People were afraid. They were paying the fines just to make the problem go away. Brenda had created a revenue stream based on intimidation. I found 3 families who were willing to talk more. An elderly couple, the Harringtons, the young mother Sarah, and a quiet man named David, a retired accountant who had been fined for having the wrong kind of bird feeder. I listened to their stories, took notes, and asked for copies of their violation notices. "She just makes up the rules as she goes along," David said, his voice trembling with a quiet rage. "I've read the bylaws cover to cover. Half the things she fines people for aren't even in there." "Why doesn't anyone stand up to her at the meetings?" I asked. "She has her cronies on the board," Sarah explained. "They shout down anyone who disagrees. It's humiliating. Most of us have just given up." I told them about my situation, about the spring, and about the research I had done. I told them I was planning to fight back, and I asked if, when the time came, they would be willing to stand with me and share their stories. A flicker of hope appeared in their eyes. They agreed. I went home and added a new section to my binder, under a tab labeled Allied Forces. I carefully filed copies of their violation notices and my notes from our conversations. The binder was now nearly 4 inches thick. It was no longer just a collection of documents, it was a weapon. It was a meticulously field-prepped opposition research file detailing a pattern of harassment, illegal demands, and likely financial malfeasance. My defenses were fortified. My alliances were forming. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. It was time to hire a lawyer. I didn't just look for any lawyer. I needed someone who understood the mission, someone who spoke my language. I found him through a veterans network, Marcus Thorne, a retired Marine Corps JAG officer who now ran a private practice specializing in property law and civil litigation. His website's motto was, "Impeccable preparation, overwhelming force." I knew he was my man. I scheduled a consultation and arrived at his office with my binder tucked under my arm like a football. Marcus was a tall, lean man with a shaved head and eyes that didn't miss a thing. He listened without interruption as I laid out the entire situation, from the first confrontation with Brenda to my call with the DEP and my recruitment of the neighborhood resistance. When I was done, I pushed the binder across his polished mahogany desk. "This is the complete documentation," I said. "Every piece of correspondence sent and received, every relevant statute highlighted, every piece of evidence cataloged and cross-referenced." Marcus opened the binder. He started with the first page and went through it slowly, methodically. He read Brenda's letters, my rebuttals, the certified mail receipt. He examined the plat maps and the copies of the deeds. He lingered on the highlighted sections of the Natural Springs and Headwaters Protection Act. He flipped to the Allied Forces section and read the stories of Arthur, Sarah, and David. He was silent for a full 10 minutes. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper in plastic sleeves. Finally, he closed the binder, placed both hands on top of it, and looked at me. A slow, appreciative grin spread across his face. "Colonel," he said, his voice full of professional admiration, "this is not a legal file. This is a kill box. You built a perfect, inescapable trap. You've documented her irrationality, her illegal demands, and her pattern of harassment. You've established that she was formally warned and chose to escalate anyway. Frankly, you've done 90% of my job for me." He leaned back in his chair. "This isn't a case we're going to win. It's a case we're going to dominate. The only question is how much damage we want to do on our way out." We spent the next hour mapping out the counteroffensive. Marcus would draft a blistering legal response to be sent not just to Brenda, but to every member of the HOA board, putting them all on notice of their potential personal liability. He would also contact the state attorney general's office, suggesting they might want to investigate the HOA's fining practices as a potential pattern of illegal extortion. "We wait for her to make one more mistake," Marcus said, tapping the binder. "She's arrogant and she feels her power is absolute. People like that always overplay their hand. She's received your letter, and soon she'll receive mine. The DEP will be sending their order. She's going to feel cornered, and she's going to do something stupid, and when she does, we'll have her." His prediction came true faster than either of us expected. A week later, I was in my workshop, restoring an old piece of furniture, when I heard the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery coming up my long gravel driveway. I put down my tools and went to the window. It was a small backhoe, followed by a pickup truck with the logo of a local landscaping company. My blood ran cold. She wouldn't. She couldn't be that reckless. I walked outside and stood at the end of my driveway, blocking their path. Two men in dusty work clothes got out of the truck. The driver, a burly man with a sunburned neck, swaggered towards me. "Morning," he grunted. "We're here to do some drainage work. Got a work order from the HOA to fill in that swampy bit down in the meadow." I held up my hand. "Turn your equipment off," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. He looked taken aback. "What?" "Turn it off, now. You are on private property, and you are about to become accessories to a felony." The man scoffed. "Look, old-timer, we've got a work order signed by the HOA president. Just step aside and let us do our job." I didn't move. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and held it up, making sure the red recording light was clearly visible. "Let me be very clear," I said, my voice now carrying the weight of decades of command. "My name is Colonel Frank Morrison, retired United States Army. This is my property. That spring you've been hired to fill in is a protected state water resource under the Natural Springs and Headwaters Protection Act. Destroying it is a Class C felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. You and your company have now been formally notified. Furthermore, your presence here constitutes criminal trespass. I am recording this entire interaction, and I have already called the sheriff's department. They are on their way. If you value your freedom and your business license, you will get back in your vehicles and leave my property immediately." The color drained from the man's face. He looked at his partner, then at the backhoe, then back at me. He saw the absolute certainty in my eyes. He saw a man who was not bluffing. We were just told it was a simple landscaping job," he stammered. "We didn't know." "Now you do," I said. "Leave." They didn't need to be told a third time. They scrambled back into their vehicles, and reversed down my driveway at a speed that was probably unsafe for heavy machinery. As soon as they were gone, I stopped the recording. My hands were perfectly steady. Brenda had just made her critical, legally damning mistake. She had moved from written threats to direct physical action. She had trespassed and attempted to hire contractors to commit a felony on her behalf. She had walked right into the kill box. I immediately called Marcus. "She did it," I said, after explaining what had just happened. "She sent a work crew." I could hear Marcus letting out a low whistle on the other end of the line. "And you got it on video?" "Every glorious second of it." "Frank, this is it," he said, his voice electric with a lawyer's predatory excitement. "This is the kill shot. She's crossed the line from civil harassment to criminal conspiracy. We've got her. We've got her dead to rights." The video was the spark that turned the smoldering resentment in the neighborhood into a full-blown rebellion. I sent the file to Sarah, David, and the Harringtons. I told them what Brenda had tried to do. Their fear was instantly replaced by pure, unadulterated outrage. The thought that the HOA president was using their dues to hire contractors to illegally destroy a neighbor's property was the final straw. "We have to do something," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger, in a group call we organized that evening. "We have to get her out." "There's an annual HOA meeting in 2 weeks," David, the retired accountant, pointed out. "It's usually a formality, no one ever goes. But the bylaws allow for a vote of no confidence if a quorum is present." The plan began to form. We would use the next 2 weeks to galvanize the rebellion. We would go door to door, armed with the video and with copies of our own bogus violation notices, and convince our neighbors to come to that meeting. We would pack the room and stage a public coup. And then 2 days later, the final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap. I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end spoke in a hushed, nervous voice. "Is this Colonel Morrison?" "It is." "My name is Carol," she said. "I was the treasurer for the HOA until last year. I quit because I couldn't stand working with Brenda anymore. I heard what she tried to do to your property. It's despicable." She paused, taking a deep breath. "There's something you should know. David was right. Brenda makes up the rules. But it's worse than that. She's been using the fines to fund her personal projects. And I think she's been embezzling money." My grip on the phone tightened. "Can you prove it?" "I have copies of all the bank statements and budgets from my time there," Carol said. "There are payments for landscaping services to a company that's owned by her cousin. The company doesn't exist. It's a shell. There are legal consultation fees that are just cash withdrawals. It's all there. I was always too scared to say anything. But what she did to you, it's too much. I can't stay silent anymore." We arranged to meet in a coffee shop in the next town over. She handed me a USB drive. "Be careful," she whispered. "She's a vindictive woman." "Vindictive people are often careless," I replied. "Thank you, Carol. You're doing the right thing." I went straight home and gave the contents of the USB drive to David. As a retired accountant, he knew exactly what he was looking at. He spent the next 2 days poring over the files, his calculator clicking away. He called me on a Friday night. His voice was grim. "It's worse than we thought, Frank," he said. "It's systematic. Over the last 2 years, she's funneled at least $50,000 of HOA funds through bogus invoices and unexplained cash withdrawals. This isn't just mismanagement. This is felony grand larceny." We now had everything: the illegal threats, the attempted destruction of property, the pattern of harassment, and now the financial kill shot. Operation Spring Freedom was about to reach its climax. The public coup was set for the annual meeting. The community hall was a low, drab building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation. On the night of the annual HOA meeting, however, it was buzzing with an energy it hadn't felt in years. We had done our work. The room was packed. Nearly every household was represented, not just by one person, but often by couples. They sat with grim, determined expressions, clutching copies of their own trumped-up violation notices like revolutionary pamphlets. At the front of the room, Brenda sat at a long folding table, flanked by her two cronies on the board, a milquetoast man named Jerry and a woman named Patricia, who nodded at everything Brenda said. Brenda was beaming, clearly misinterpreting the record turnout as a sign of her own popularity. She was wearing a violently pink pantsuit and had a large, ornate gavel in her hand, which she banged on the table to call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many of you taking an active interest in our beautiful community, she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. She droned on for a few minutes with her president's report, a self-congratulatory monologue about property values and aesthetic harmony. Then she made a fatal mistake. Finally, she said, a smug look on her face, I want to address a persistent compliance issue with a non-member property adjacent to our community, which has been affecting our safety and aesthetics. We are pursuing all legal avenues to ensure this matter is resolved. That was our cue. As planned, I stood up from my seat in the front row. Marcus, my lawyer, stood beside me, looking imposing in a perfectly tailored suit. A point of order, Madam President, I said, my voice cutting through the room. Brenda's smile vanished. You are not a member of this association. You have no right to speak. On the contrary, Marcus interjected, his voice calm and authoritative. My client's property has been named. He has every right to respond to what is a clear and defamatory accusation. Furthermore, I am here as his legal counsel to inform you, and the entire board, that you are presiding over an association that is currently under investigation by the State Department of Environmental Protection and the Attorney General's Office for a pattern of illegal harassment and attempted criminal conspiracy. A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda's face went from pink to ghostly white. That's a lie, she shrieked, banging her gavel uselessly. Is it? I asked calmly. I turned to David, who was manning a projector we had set up. David, if you would, Exhibit A. The image of Brenda's first violation letter, the one on the cream-colored cardstock, appeared on the screen behind her. For the past 6 weeks, I began, addressing the crowd, your HOA president has been engaged in a campaign of escalating harassment against me. She has illegally demanded that I destroy a state-protected spring on my property. I laid out the entire timeline, calmly and factually. With each point, David put up a new slide, a copy of my certified letter, the plat map showing the property lines, the highlighted text of the state law Brenda had chosen to ignore. She was informed of the illegality of her demands in writing, I continued, and her response was to escalate the fines and hire a lawyer at your expense. Then came the grand finale of my presentation. When her written threats failed, she took direct action. David, play the video. The video I had taken on my phone filled the screen. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the landscaping truck and backhoe rumbled onto my property. They heard the contractor state he was there on Brenda's orders to fill in that swampy bit. They heard my clear, concise warning about the felony they were about to commit. They watched the contractors panic and flee. When the video ended, the room was silent for a moment, and then a low murmur of outrage began to build. Brenda was on her feet, her face a mask of fury. This is an illegal recording. It's inadmissible. You are all being lied to. Now it's your turn, I said, nodding to Arthur, the elderly rose gardener. One by one, our allies stood up. Arthur spoke about the fine for his garden hose. Sarah spoke about the harassment over her child's tricycle. The Harringtons spoke about being fined because their mailbox paint was faded by the sun. A dozen other people, emboldened by the moment, stood up to share their own stories of petty fines and public humiliation. The chorus of dissent grew into a roar. The foundation of Brenda's power, the fear and silence of her neighbors, was crumbling before her eyes. Then David stood up. "But the harassment isn't the worst of it," he said, his voice ringing with the authority of a man who knows his numbers. "The real question is, where has all the money from these fines been going?" He put a new slide on the screen. It was a simple pie chart from the HOA's official budget, showing a massive expenditure for landscaping and grounds maintenance. "And now," David said, "let's look at the actual bank records." The next slide was a bank statement with a series of large, regular payments highlighted in yellow. The recipient was a company called Brenda's Blooming Gardens, LLC. "I did a little research," David said, his voice cold as ice. "This company was registered 2 years ago. Its address is a P.O. box, and its sole officer is Brenda's cousin, who lives 2 states away and works as a dog groomer. The company has no equipment, no employees, and no other clients. It's a shell corporation designed for one purpose: to launder your money into Brenda's pocket." He put up the final slide. It showed the total amount paid to the shell company alongside a tally of unexplained cash withdrawals and legal fees that corresponded with no legal work. The grand total at the bottom of the screen was over $50,000. The room exploded. The noise was deafening. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing at Brenda. She completely imploded. All pretense of control vanished, replaced by pure, shrieking rage. "Lies! It's all lies! You can't prove any of this! I am the president! I have the authority!" She was banging her gavel over and over, the sound lost in the tidal wave of fury from the homeowners she had bullied for so long. Mr. Harrington, a man who had been quiet for years, stood on a chair, his face red with righteous anger. "I make a motion for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of Brenda and her entire board." "I second the motion," Sarah yelled from across the room. The motion was technically against the rules of order, but no one cared. The revolution had its own momentum now. "All in favor of removing the board, say aye," Mr. Harrington boomed. The responding "aye" was a physical force, a deafening roar that shook the cheap wooden rafters of the community hall. It was the sound of 100 silenced voices finding their power all at once. All opposed? Dead silence. Even Jerry and Patricia, Brenda's cronies, were sinking down in their chairs, trying to become invisible. Brenda stood frozen for a moment, her mouth open, her face a grotesque collage of shock and hate. Her reign was over. Her power, which had always been an illusion, had vanished in an instant. Stripped of her title and her authority, she was just a bitter, defeated woman in a pink pantsuit. She grabbed her purse, shoved past her former board members, and fled the room, pursued by the jeers and angry shouts of the community she had terrorized. The coup was complete. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the vacuum of power left by Brenda's spectacular implosion, a new interim board was elected on the spot. David, the accountant, was unanimously voted in as the new president. Sarah and Mr. Harrington took the other 2 seats. Their very first act, passed by a unanimous voice vote from everyone still in the room, was to void every fine issued by Brenda's board over the previous 2 years. A wave of palpable relief washed over the crowd. It was as if a great dark cloud had finally lifted from the neighborhood. Their second act was to issue a formal, public apology to me on behalf of the entire community. They officially recognized the legal sovereignty of my property and the protected status of the spring. They thanked me for having the courage to stand up and expose the corruption. It was a humbling moment. I hadn't set out to be a hero. I had just wanted to be left alone. But in fighting for my own peace, I had inadvertently liberated an entire neighborhood. The reckoning for Brenda was far more severe. Armed with David's meticulous financial analysis and the evidence from my binder, the new board filed a civil lawsuit against her to recover the embezzled $50,000. Marcus also forwarded the entire package, the financial records, the video, the DEP case file to the county's district attorney. A criminal investigation was launched. Brenda was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. The charge for attempting to hire contractors to destroy a protected state resource was, ironically, the least of her legal worries. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she pleaded guilty. The financial ruin was total. The court ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. The legal fees bankrupted her. A lien was placed on her house, the very weapon she had so eagerly wielded against others. Not by the HOA, but by the bank and the courts. She was forced to sell her home in disgrace to cover her debts and legal obligations. The last I saw of her, she was loading cardboard boxes into the back of a U-Haul, her face a permanent mask of sour defeat. She left the community not with a bang, but with the quiet, pathetic whimper of a failed tyrant. In the months that followed, the atmosphere in the estates at Whispering Pines transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a genuine sense of community. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Kids' toys were left on lawns without fear of a citation. Arthur's garden hose was coiled in any way he saw fit. The beige tyranny was over. People started painting their doors different colors. It was a small thing, but it was beautiful. The new board, under David's sensible leadership, rewrote the bylaws to be simpler, fairer, and focused on genuine issues of safety and maintenance, not aesthetic oppression. They became facilitators of community, not enforcers of arbitrary rules. And me? I finally got my peace. I sit here now, on a cool autumn morning, on the porch of my farmhouse. A mug of hot coffee warms my hands. Down in the meadow, the willows that guard my spring are turning a brilliant gold. The water bubbles up from the earth, clear and constant, just as it has for 1,000 years, utterly indifferent to the petty dramas of humankind. The binder, Operation Spring Freedom, sits on a shelf in my study. Its mission is complete. Sometimes I take it down and look through it, not with anger, but with a sense of profound satisfaction. It is a monument to a simple truth, that a single, well-documented fact is more powerful than 1,000 baseless threats. The fight was not one I sought, but it was one I am glad I fought. It taught me that sometimes the only way to protect your sanctuary is to be willing to go to war for it. It proved that one person, armed with patience, meticulous preparation, and the rule of law, can dismantle a petty tyrant's reign. Tyranny, whether on a grand scale or in a small neighborhood, thrives in darkness and withers in the light of truth. All you have to do is be willing to flip the switch, and then you can get back to the simple, sacred business of being left alone.